Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to you all as chairman of the Budgetary Control Committee, but also as one of the four chairmen leading this meeting towards a high degree of accountability, transparency and integrity in the EU institutions. I would like to welcome all the members who are here, but also, more to the point, the guests here in Parliament. This is a first. We've never had a meeting in the Parliament with four different committees, and it really is a worthwhile meeting because it really brings to the fore the fact that there are issues that all of us are working on which overlap and come together. So I'm very pleased to see the chairman here, and they'll get the floor in a minute. When it comes to the Budgetary Control Committee, accountability is our bread and butter. We're very pleased then that other committees have their contribution to make sure that we can improve things even more. I don't want to take up too much time, so without further ado, I'll give the floor to Mrs. Danuta Hübner, Chairman of the Constitutional Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Inge. Thank you very much. I would like to say that for all of us here, making the European Union more democratic and bringing it also closer to the citizens is one of the biggest priorities. I think it's for all the committees, but for our committees in particular. And to make the European Union decision-making process more transparent is a precondition for this participation in the decision-making process. And this is both true for the legislation, but also in more general terms for decision-making in Europe. But we also know that transparency is not enough. It's extremely important. It's the beginning, but it is not enough. And our commitment and our task, as we see it in our committees, is to ensure the highest level of integrity of European institutions, of the Parliament in particular. And that's why we are here. We are here because we are committed to achieve the highest degree of accountability, the highest degree of transparency and of integrity. And AFCO, the committee I'm chairing, which is responsible for the implementation of the Union's primary law and also for the European Parliament rules of procedure, AFCO is also starting the preparation of an own initiative report on transparency, accountability and integrity in the European Union institutions. And this joint hearing is for us a very important initial step. We hope to get from this hearing also inspiration, and we want to hear also what are your expectations vis-à-vis this type of report. Thank you, and I understand, Inge, that we give the floor now to Claudio.
Thank you very much, Inge, and thank you, Danuta. We are very pleased to be part of this joint hearing for the Libe Committee. In the area of freedom, security and justice, there's often a very important reference to mutual trust between member states. It goes to the heart of what it means to trust citizens. And there is no trust without dealing with the very important issues of transparency and the very practical issues of corruption and issues that really go to the heart of what citizens care about, particularly in member states where this is a very tangible and difficult issue. So the Libe Committee is delighted to be part of this very important initiative, which I feel has a disproportionate effect on the way the European Union is working, and citizens feel that it's a vitally important issue. So I'm also very pleased that we're working as our joint committees in this way. I think this also sends a very important message to our citizens institutionally. So the Libe Committee will participate at 11:30 on this issue of the prevention of corruption and possible accession of the EU to GRECO, and I'm delighted to be involved in that section towards the end of the seminar. So thank you again, Inga, for our participation of Libe.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear members, dear guests, I am very pleased to welcome you as Vice Chair of the Committee on Legal Affairs. to this joint hearing of 4 committees, which is, as I'm a new member of Parliament, I didn't know, but I hear that it is an event in the history of the European Parliament. In April 2014, Transparency International published the European Union Integrity System, a report which covers 10 EU institutions, agencies, bodies, and deals with transparency, with anti-corruption and accountability matters, and maintaining a high degree of transparency and integrity is one of the crucial elements in our work and underlines the commitments we have towards Union citizens. So I am extremely pleased that I can co-host this joint hearing, and the purpose of the hearing is to gather into a deep discussion over this subject of a very high importance and consider together the way forward. So I will give the floor back to Madame Gressler, who will chair the first panel.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks a lot, dear colleagues, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll start with the first part of the budgetary control part, the European Union Integrity System. As Mrs. Delvaux has just said, last year around the time of the European elections, there was a study from Transparency International. We're very pleased that the head of the office, Carl Dolan, is here with us, and also Mr. Daniel Freund. So today we'll get a presentation of this study for the first time in the European Parliament. I think it's important, and the Budgetary Control Committee believes it important for Transparency International to be given an opportunity to present this study, because it's certainly something that can help us and certainly will be something to help improve the work we're doing. So I'm certainly looking forward to your presentation. Mr. Dolan and Mr. Freund, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm Carl Dolan. I'm the Director of the Transparency International EU office. It's a bit like buses, this hearing. You wait 1 year for a committee hearing on your report, and then 4 come along all at once. But in all seriousness, I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today in the Parliament. The very fact that this hearing has been convened by 4 parliamentary committees is a testimony to the urgency of the issue, and also the commitment of MEPs to strengthening the EU integrity system. That system, as has been said, has been mapped and assessed in a comprehensive manner for the first time in the report that we published in April last year. And it's this big beast of a report here that you can find on the table just by the podium there. I don't think I could do justice to the nearly 250 pages of research collected over 9 months, spanning 10 EU institutions and bodies in the very short time allotted to me here today. So instead, I will confine myself to some of the broader themes that have emerged from this study and urge you all to take a much closer look at the report following today's discussion. The integrity of political institutions is, of course, their most important asset. The legitimacy and effectiveness of these institutions depends, to a large degree, not on the resources they command, nor the legal foundations on which they are built, nor on the efficiency of their procedures, but on the complex web of trust relations that sustain them. That trust is sustained in turn by the integrity of the institutions and the people who run them. It is also their most fragile asset. It can take years to cultivate and yet disappear overnight, leading to a loss of trust and a hollowing of institutional authority. One has only to look around the globe, from Ukraine to Mexico to Afghanistan, to see where this has happened to an alarming extent. The institutions that make up the European Union have not plumbed these depths, of course, but there is evidence that trust has been steadily ebbing away in recent years. According to Eurobarometer surveys, ever since the halcyon pre-crisis days of spring 2007, there has been a 22% drop in the trust in institutions, while the number of respondents who have a negative image of the EU has doubled. True, EU institutions still enjoy slightly greater levels of trust than the average for member state institutions. But this should give us little comfort. The overall trends are convergence and decline. While this is a part of a larger social phenomenon of loss of trust in political institutions, loss of trust in authority in general, EU policymakers have a particular cause for concern. If the past years have taught us anything, it is that the European project is also a fragile one. Comparisons with national institutions that have deeper roots and affinities may lead to a misplaced complacency. And this brings us to one of the major themes of our EU integrity study. The institutions are, of course, part of a mature democratic system with a solid foundation in treaties, regulations and protocols. They have all the formal hallmarks of accountability and transparency that one would expect of a well-governed polity. Although, what I would say at this point is that we, of course, assessed the institutions that are established by the treaties, by and large. What we have seen over the last 4 or 5 years in response to the euro crisis and the financial crisis is a certain amount of ad hoc institutional building, and indeed that there are a number of groups, institutions and funds that are now instituted outside of the treaties and outside of the formal accountability and transparency procedures that are established for other institutions. And that is something that is of concern to us, and that's something that we will return to at a later date. But in respect to the treaties and in respect of their formal accountability and transparency procedures, the European institutions are, in some cases, the equal of or better than their member states. But this has led to complacency about some of the risks to its integrity. Perhaps the best example is the issue of lobbying. Brussels is synonymous with regulation, of course, and the expansion of the single market in the 80s and 90s. It has become a magnet for interest groups of all persuasions. It is second only to Washington, D.C., with estimates of up to 30,000 professional lobbyists plying their trade. Notably, most of the recent corruption scandals within the institutions have revolved around attempts to influence the legislative process. In these circumstances, it is not enough to point to the fact that few other national capitals have a functioning lobby register. There must be an honest assessment whether a voluntary system of lobby registration, with virtually no sanctions for abuse and often outdated or meaningless information about lobbying activities, is an effective way of reassuring a sceptical public that institutions have not been hijacked by corporate interests. When 70% of the EU public believes that corruption is present in EU institutions, as has been found in recent surveys, it is likely that they are not thinking of bribes and kickbacks, but rather that policymakers and lobby groups are colluding to ensure that their interests trump the public interest. That is why comparisons with national capitals are misleading, and indeed our study made no such comparison. A properly functioning integrity system must be seen in its own context and be adequate to the nature of the risks. That is why we have recommended in our report to raise the transparency bar further by the creation of a legislative footprint for EU-level lobbying. And a legislative footprint, what we mean by that is a detailed record of the contact with and the input from lobbyists in the making of legislation and policy. And indeed, if you have any further questions about what that entails or how one would go about creating a legislative footprint, we have recently published a policy paper on that very topic, and there are copies of the policy paper also just by the podium for you later. Now, we are pleased to see that the new Commission has taken some initial steps in this direction, and we would urge all the institutions to go faster and further. This commitment to transparency by default should also address other blind spots in the legislative process. These typically involve decision-making between the institutions, such as negotiations between representatives in trilogue meetings or between the Member States and the Council. Our view is that much can be done to improve the transparency of these critical decision-making processes without the need to sacrifice the space necessary for dialogue and for compromise. A recent European Court of Justice ruling, which would have allowed the public access to information on Member State positions in Council negotiations, confirms this view. It is very sad, therefore, to see the Council attempting to undermine the spirit of this ruling by classifying an increasing number of documents as effectively secret, limite. This commitment to transparency by default is important also because it signals a sincere desire for partnership with the wider public in promoting integrity. If there is one thing that Transparency International has learned in 21 years of fighting corruption, it's that no major progress can occur without this partnership between public authorities and civil society, including the private sector. In the absence of a proactive culture of transparency, we are left instead with a culture of compliance. This is clear from the EU institutions' management of conflicts of interest. As you might expect, there are many rules, bodies and processes in place, but there has been a puzzling reluctance to make them truly effective. Only lip service is paid to the business of monitoring or preventing conflicts of interest. For example, we found no evidence of systematic checks on the financial interests declared by commissioners or MEPs. Perhaps more importantly, where there are ethics committees or similar bodies who oversee the implementation of these rules, they lack both independence and teeth. And indeed, we see there is also a preference for self-regulation in the composition and the functioning of these bodies, and their recommendations are neither public nor binding. This has led to a regrettable situation where, despite a number of recommendations by the European Parliament's own Advisory Committee on the Code of Conduct, for example, no sanctions have ever been imposed on an MEP even when that code was clearly violated. The compliance culture can also be seen in two other areas where we found vulnerabilities to the EU integrity system. They are whistleblowing procedures and public procurement. Once again, the rules are clearly spelled out in both the financial and the staff regulations. In the case of whistleblowing, however, only 1 out of the 10 institutions that we assessed had done anything to create a culture where good faith whistleblowers are welcomed and made feel secure. Institutions can do this by putting in place clear procedures and guidelines and communicating those to their members or staff. Indeed, there is a legal obligation to do so since early 2014. In the case of public procurement, despite the European Commission having the discretion to debar companies when good evidence of corruption is presented to them, what we found is that discretion had only been used once, on one occasion, in the last 5 years. And one is tempted to contrast this with the performance of the World Bank, which had debarred hundreds of corrupt companies over a much shorter period, and 30 of them European companies indeed. Now, it remains to be seen whether the recent reforms proposed to the European Commission's debarment system will encourage greater use of that discretion. All of this is very far removed from treaty provisions that declare in ringing tones, and I quote, "In order to promote good governance and ensure the participation of civil society, the Union institutions shall conduct their work as openly as possible," close quote. Or indeed, codes of conduct that state unequivocally that, I quote, "ruling out all risks of conflicts of interest helps guarantee commissioners' independence," close quote. It should be clear that all of this is independent of debates about ever closer union. Whether you think there should be more EU or less EU, whether the EU should be more concerned about the contents of bank balance sheets than olive oil containers, whether our global aspirations are enhanced or hampered by the EU, all of these different visions will require open, responsive, independent and accountable institutions that can effectively prevent and punish corruption. That, as we see it, is the challenge for the next parliamentary mandate and the challenge for a new generation of EU policy makers. What is needed is to rescue the original vision of strong, independent EU institutions vigilantly upholding the rule of law from compromise, complacency and mere compliance. They must find that spirit of partnership and openness that can make the EU integrity system the envy of political institutions and citizens around the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Herr Dolan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dolan. And I'd like to express respect for the detailed study that you've produced, and managing to summarize that in 15 minutes is quite a task in itself, and you managed that. I have a number of questions on some of the points you raised. I think we in the Parliament have a specific problem. We're publicly elected parliamentarians. And the question of how we can deal with these issues is one thing. It's been following us for a long time, but we're independent. We cannot be bound in our mandate, which means that to an extent you can do what you want, but within that mandate that we are given, there are certain things that you have to do. There's certain freedoms you have at the same time. And it would be interesting to hear from you about how, on this particular point, we can make progress. The independence of our mandate is of great value. In the different member states, we have very different values and practices, and I notice in my day-to-day work that in the different perceptions that exist, I mean, what is control? We have a French colleague, for example, so when I talk to French colleagues, I find it very difficult reaching agreement. Oh, you're not French. Oh, sorry. But we have very many cultural differences. And I don't want somebody who is in a civil servant position judging me and us, because it's a question of me being responsible to my electorate. So in this multicultural body that we work for, there is a great deal that is done differently. So the international nature of our work and the pioneer character of the work as well, I think needs to be noted. So I was wondering what sort of ideas you would have on that front. On lobbying, I've been in the Budgetary Control Committee for 10 years, and almost for the entire length of those 10 years I've been tearing my hair out trying to work out how we can regulate lobbyists in a decent way. There have been regrettable cases where members have taken money for amendments. I mean, this idea that you can give money for amendments could only have come from journalists, because anybody who knows the legislative process would know that just because you table amendments, it's not going to change anything. And you wouldn't be able to buy up enough people in the legislative process to have an overall impact. So, obviously there are always bad apples, but we're talking about bad apples in a large fruit market. So we're looking at the rules that need to be put in place. It's not a question of finding the extreme cases and then enforcing some form of collective punishment, if you like, and punishing everybody else. So what are the 10 most important things in your view when it comes to lobbying, legislative footprint and transparency? What needs to be done there? But I would ask that you take into consideration the independence of our mandate, because without that independence of mandate, we cannot work. It doesn't mean you can do whatever you want, but maybe I could give you the floor straight away to answer that.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, on your first point, that's very clear. I mean, of course, maybe as important as the rules, maybe even indeed more important than the rules, is the question of organizational culture. When we're talking about integrity, we're talking about ethics, we're talking about culture. And of course, this is something that can be very difficult to achieve, that kind of cohesive culture, particularly in a multinational, multicultural environment. That's not unique to the European Parliament. It's also true of the European Commission. And I know this is something that was a concern that was raised in the course of our interviews for this study. What I would say, however, that in that case is that perhaps there is even more important to have very, very clearly defined rules. When you can't rely on a cohesive culture and a cohesive sense of ethics, the rules have to be very clear. And here in the Parliament, of course, particularly when it comes to some aspects of the Code of Conduct, I'm thinking in particular of the rules around the financial declarations, the rules are not very, very clear, and this is something that we have documented recently, that there needs to be much, much better guidance and much clearer rules about those financial declarations, precisely because there are these very different interpretations, very different political cultures in this House. Also, what I would say on that, and that this links to your next point about lobbying, is many of our recommendations are not indeed about changing the rules at all. we have proposed, as I said in my speech, that each of the institutions should create a legislative footprint, which is a detailed record of the contacts of lobbyists. Now, this could be done, as the Commission has done it, through a formal institutional decision. It could be done, for example, here by changing the rules of procedure, but it doesn't need to be. All it would take is for MEPs themselves to take the initiative to record that on their website. It's a very simple thing. Many MEPs are actually doing it already. Many political groups are actually doing it already. With modern technology, it's not that much of an administrative burden. So even without infringing on anybody's mandate, I think there are many things that, many initiatives that individual MEPs or groups could do to bring their work closer to citizens, to be much more transparent about their work. Now, perhaps the most challenging thing, the biggest challenge you have now offered me is to give you a list of 10 things, 10 of the most important things. We have, it's a very big report, of course. We have tried to succinctly state what are the most important recommendations in the executive summary. We have 13, I think, or 12 or 13 of the most important recommendations for all the EU institutions at the outset of our report. Those are also summarized in a special 4-page brochure, which we have produced specially for this hearing. So, again, I mean, what I would say is the main, to summarize very quickly there, it's around the main issues are around the transparency of the legislative procedure, around management of conflicts of interest, it's around whistleblowing procedures, it's around making investigation of corruption at EU level much more effective, and here the independence of OLAF is crucial, of course. And it's also about having effective deterrence for corruption, like the debarment system. So those, for us, are the 5 main clusters of recommendations where the EU institutions can make progress in very quick time.
Vielen Dank. Ich habe Wortmeldungen, und zwar.
Thank you very much. We have a speaker, Mr. Wierzchowski. I'm very sorry I got your name wrong.
I would like to speak in Polish. Pani Przewodnicząca, Szanowni koledzy i koleżanki, ja chcę zapytać właśnie...
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you how you see this, how you see transparency in the European Parliament. We're working on the set of the House rules of the European Parliament, rules of procedure, and we have a working party on it. I think that the European Parliament is less transparent than national parliaments. Obviously, we've made our voting on legislation public, but there's still so many things being done behind closed doors. Anyway, it's very difficult in those conditions to really perform our scrutiny function. Public scrutiny and the fight against corruption very difficult if you don't know how members have voted. Perhaps we could, have more transparency in the European Parliament. I think that would help the process. People would know how members are voting. We can't just have empty statements by members of Parliament on this. And I think we need to reduce the amount of lobbying. Transparency is important. But if we want to improve things, we should start, you start by putting your own house in order, and we need to have more transparency. We need to set the example. And if we were to set an example of transparency, then that would be very motivating for other EU institutions. Thank you.
Kollegin, die ich gerne gleich...
Yes, two other colleagues who would like to ask questions. So, for reasons of time, could you please be quick? Mr. Jauregui. Thank you very much. I have a couple of practical examples, and I'd like to know what you think about these things. If you look at what's happening today, we need to be positive about transparency, because I think that the new technology available gives us a tremendous opportunity to be more transparent. But I think that transparency in general is a vital way of fighting against corruption and of promoting democratic legitimacy. Let me look at a couple of problems today. I'd look at the way the European Union is acting in two specific areas. Negotiations on the TTIP, the trade agreement with the United States, is something that people want to know about. And the people negotiating it at the Commission are not telling anybody what's going on. They're not keeping us abreast of what's going on day by day. And that means, obviously, there are certain constraints. You cannot have complete transparency. But in such a complex process, you do need a degree of transparency. That's the first problem. Second problem. Yesterday, in this Parliament, we discussed a Commission proposal from last week, which is trying to clear up the Lux Leaks Scandal, which has been, journalists have been focusing on that a lot recently. And to sort it out, the Commission has developed a proposal for a reform of an existing directive to say that, as of now, Member States must recognise agreements between governments and companies. But this will all be known about by the governments, but not by the citizens. Why not? Why can't citizens be informed of these things, or the media? But if the Commission has decided on that degree of transparency that Member States must inform other Member States of their agreements with companies, why not inform the citizens as well? They must do that. What's the solution to these problems? Thank you.
Frau Kollegin Guillaume, bitte.
Ms. Guillaume. Thank you, and thank you for giving me the floor. The President of Parliament has made a statement on the lobbyist register, the transparency register. I think that's very important. I don't agree with what my colleagues have said about transparency in the European Parliament. I think that what's happened over the past few years means that we have made serious progress, and we are well ahead of national parliaments in the practice of transparency. And I think it's rather symptomatic that we should discuss this in this context, because, here we are in a kind of a face-off between the virtuous and the non-virtuous, and it means that this is not what we're trying to do. Mr. Jauregui reminded us rightly that we need to keep in our minds our general aim, which is to be transparent in order to combat corruption. And it also helps democracy flow. So we shouldn't be lumping things together. What we have is exceptions that create rules, and that should not be the way it goes. The general rule should be transparency. When I'm working on some of the things we're trying to do, the way we're trying to change our practices, For example, the rules on statements of interest or declarations of interest. We're trying to get the mainstreaming going in the right direction and mainstream it into all our legislative practice. We've got to make progress on individually, but also with our general practices. And what I'd like to input into this debate is this. Are we applying pressure in the right place? And are people like Transparency International, taking action on the lobbyists, not just members of Parliament? I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to change things to guarantee the way individuals behave. Maybe we should work on the way individuals behave in order to bring about the general change. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Spinelli.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you. Could I just go back to what Ms. Gressler said about our independence in exercising our mandate and transparency? That is one of the founding principles of parliamentary democracy. That it is not binding. But it's also a principle that protects us as democratic representatives. Now, democracy is going through a very serious crisis, representative democracy. So I wonder whether we shouldn't correct the independence of our mandates, adjust it to protect the people we represent and not just us as representatives. There is a basic difference of opinion between citizens and institutions, representatives and those they represent, and that's what I want to ask about. Because that's what representatives are asking for today. That's what the people we represent are asking for today, is transparency and no corruption. If you take things like Lux Leaks or TTIP as examples, what does it mean in constitutional terms to have really solid principles about the independence of your mandate, but not sufficiently solid principles for defending our citizens? Thank you.
Ja, Fragen mit philosophischem Hintergrund.
Well, very philosophical question. So would you like to respond, please?
Well, I am a philosophy graduate, so I do welcome these sort of questions. But I think perhaps maybe to address some of the more practical issues first, I think I happen to agree with the Vice President. I don't think that and certainly we didn't find any evidence for this, that the European Parliament is very untransparent as an institution. Now, I have to stress that it was not the object of our study to make systematic comparisons between national institutions and the European institutions, but in many respects, in terms of the legislative procedure, it is a very transparent institution. I mean, committee debates are web streamed. We have virtually all the documents are put online. Maybe not in good time always, but they are available online. So I think in terms of the actual legislative procedures, there is a very high degree of transparency there. Where I would agree with the Polish member is perhaps there can be improvements made, certainly around the transparency of voting. I think voting not just in plenary but committee votes. I think we have again the technology to make that much more transparent than it is at the moment, and perhaps in terms of the Parliament's own decision making about its own administration and its own procedures, perhaps there could be more transparency at that level as well. But where I think what our study has emphasized is that it's less about the procedures within the institutions, either the Parliament or the Commission. The main blind spots, the gaps, are where the institutions negotiate with each other. Of particular concern here is the trend towards informal decision-making in trilogue meetings. Here there is a very poor level of transparency, even when the meetings are taking place, who's participating, very basic information is not available to the public. And that also leads on to the question by the Spanish member about issues such as the transparency of international negotiations. And I think there is an issue here. There's also an issue which I think has been highlighted by the Parliament before about the EU's participation in international bodies, for example, like the Basel Committee, for example, which sets global rules. I mean, there are some very serious issues around the transparency of these international bodies and international negotiations like TTIP. We have, along with other civil society colleagues, made our concerns known about the lack of transparency in TTIP. I'm very pleased to see the Commission is making some improvements there. But, of course, I think we could go a lot further. I also 100% agree with the Spanish member about the issue of transparency of these tax rulings, which was announced recently by the Commission. Now, we haven't really touched on our report about transparency legislation, and there has been quite a lot of very good transparency legislation that the EU has passed in recent years for the oil and gas industry, for example, very good transparency legislation for anti-money laundering. But I think what should be done now is not just make this information available to national authorities, who are in any case overwhelmed often with this kind of information, but there should be public disclosure of these rulings and of this sort of information by companies themselves. So what we are hoping, what we as Transparency International would like to see over the next couple of years is EU legislation that would make it mandatory for companies to be much more transparent about the sort of financial information relating to tax and other matters. The Vice President had a very specific question about whether we were pointing out the right things, and that we need to bear in mind which is to prevent corruption. And of course, we wholeheartedly agree that the transparency here needs to be proportionate to the goal. Of course, what I would say here, of course, is that, and as I said in my opening remarks, corruption here may not only mean, for example, the offering of bribes or kickbacks, but corruption can, in a broader sense, mean that legislation and policy is not made in the public interest, that legislation and policy is made for a few special interests. And I think there is a very deep suspicion amongst the wider public that this is happening. Now, whether this is true or not, I think we don't really have the evidence for it. Perhaps it's exaggerated. But I think we need a lot more transparency about that process, about the influence of lobbyists on legislation, to make that judgment. And the question is, should the obligations be just for MEPs and not only for lobbyists? Well, I think lobbyists themselves can be a lot more transparent. Some of them are. I know for a fact we ourselves have taken the step of publishing all our meetings, effectively lobby meetings with the decision makers, and we will be doing that on our website from now on. So I think, yes, possibly more can be done there. And finally, on the philosophical question about whether we are in a crisis of democracy or not, I mean, perhaps that requires another hearing. But again, what I would like to emphasize is that none of what we are proposing, to my knowledge, infringes on the mandate. I think all of this can be done within the context of a free mandate, and I don't see any conflict there at all.
Vielen Dank, Herr Dolan, für.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dolan, for your presentation and for the colleagues for the debate. And our next speaker, Ms. Delvaux. Thank you. We'll move on to the second panel, which is on a code of conduct for commissioners.